Hello dear students, my name is Zalina Satılganova and I am glad to be your English teacher today. Today we will talk about most commonly used modal verbs in modern English. Let's start our lesson. Today we will talk about most commonly used modal verbs in English language. What are modal verbs? We can also call them just modals. Modals express ability, possibility, prediction, permission, obligation, advice, and opinion according to the situation. We use modal verbs as helping words in combination with main verbs. We cannot use a modal verb by itself. These are the modal verbs we mostly use in modern English. Can, could, may, might, shall, should, ought, must, have to, need to, will, would. This is the formula of forming positive sentence with modal verb. Subject plus modal verb plus main verb in infinitive and object. Let's look at an example with a modal verb must, which expresses obligation and opinion. You might this book. It seems like something is strange with this sentence. I must what? We need a main verb. Let's take a verb read. You must read this book is a correct sentence. This sentence talks about obligation or an opinion to read this book. We can also use read with other modal verbs. For example, you may read this book. In this case, we have modal verb may, which expresses permission or possibility. Here are modal verbs expressing different meanings and also some exercises with help of these modal verbs. For example, can, could express ability. She can play the piano. Or I could run fast when I was young. The next modal verbs are can, could, and may expressing permission. For example, can I borrow your phone? You may have a cookie if you eat your dinner. Should expresses advice. I think you should exercise more. Or in a question, should I go to school today? May, might, could, and can express possibility. I might go to the gym today. We can hang out tomorrow if you are free. And modal verbs must and have to express obligation. You must finish your homework. You have to clean the house. Modal verbs behave differently from main verbs. Modal verbs give different meanings to main verbs. That is why sometimes modal verbs might be confusing. What should we do? We need to know some rules of using modal verbs. Rule number 1. We use modal verb as it is. We don't change it in present, past, and future tenses. We also don't change it in the third person. For example, we take modal verb can, which expresses an ability. And here we have a sentence. She can swims. Do you think it is a correct sentence? No, it is incorrect. We should say she can swim. We don't need any endings after the verbs. When do we use can and could? For example, as we remember, can and could express ability. We use can in present tense. For example, I can speak English well. We use could in the past. For example, I could speak English well when I was a child. The next case when we use can and could is when we have a request. Requests can be informal. For example, can you open the door? Or when we want to be more polite, we can say, could you open the door? We can also use can and could when we ask for permission. For example, in informal situation, you can say, "Can you give me your pencil?" But if you want to be more polite, you can say, "Could you give me your pencil?" Rule number 2 says about using basic verb just after the modal verbs. We don't use to. For example, there is a formula of making up a sentence in a positive sentence. Subject plus modal verb without to, plus main verb if in infinitive, and object. Please pay attention to the exception. Have to and need to are used with the part to. In this case, we need to remember that have to and need to can be used in place of must. And ought to is also used with the part to. It is the same as the modal verb should. For example, may expresses permission or possibility. He may to come to me. It is incorrect. We don't say that. We say, he may come to me. We don't use to after the modal verb. Rule number 3 is about modal verbs used in negative sentences. Use not just after the modal verbs. Don't use don't, doesn't, isn't, wasn't, or won't. For example, we can take the modal verb should or ought to. They both have the same meanings. They express advice. For example, let's look at this sentence. You don't should smoke. It seems this sentence is not correct. Why? Because the rule says we don't use don't. We should say you should not or you shouldn't smoke. And an example with the modal verb ought to, you don't ought to smoke. This sentence is also incorrect. We shouldn't say you don't ought to smoke, but you ought not to smoke. Here, I would like to pay your attention that when we use can in negative meaning, we write it as one word, cannot, or as abbreviated can't. For example, we cannot or we can't visit you today. My father is sick. There is also an exception. When we use have to and need to instead of must, because they have the same meanings, we use don't before these two verbs. For example, you don't have to come to school today. Or you don't need to come to school today. Let's look at the case when we use should and ought to. These two verbs have same meaning but different form. For example, we use should when we want to be more informal or more common. Ought to is more formal, more old-fashioned, and less common. Should is used in everyday spoken and written English, and ought to is mostly used in written speech. As the rule number 2 says, we use modal verb should without to. But ought to, as you can see, is an exception from the rule. We use to after ought. And also when we use should in a negative form, we say shouldn't. We can abbreviate it. But ought to in negative sentences is used without any contraction. For example, ought not to. This is the full version we have to use in the sentences. Let's look at some examples with should and ought to. Example number 1. You shouldn't waste your time in front of computer. And with ought to in negative form, you ought not to waste your time in front of computer. As you can see, the meanings are the same, but the forms are different. Let's look at the cases when we use modal verbs in yes and no questions. How do we form questions with modal verbs? In building up positive sentences, we have subject plus modal verb plus main verb in infinitive and object. In the question sentences without questions, we have the following formula: modal verb plus subject plus main verb in infinitive and object. As we know, question sentences can be also with question words. Question word plus modal verb plus subject and main verb in infinitive and object will help us to build up question sentences with question words. Let's look at some examples. In a positive sentence, I should study hard, we see should in the second position. Let's make up a question sentence without question word. Should I study hard? You can see that in the positive sentence, in the question sentence, the positions of the subject and the modal verb have changed. Here are some examples I would like you to look at. Positive sentences, for example, question sentences, and possible answers to those questions. Everyone should see that film. Let's make up a question sentence. Should everyone see that film? And possible answers to this question would be yes, or yes, everyone should. Or you can say in full sentence, yes, everyone should see that film. As we know, should and ought to have the same meanings but different forms. Let's look at the sentence with ought to. Positive sentence will be everyone ought to see that film. And question sentence will be ought not everyone to see that film? And possible answers to this question will be yes, or yes, everyone ought to, or yes, everyone ought to see that film. Let's make up a question sentence with a question word. What time should I go there? And with ought to, what time ought I to go there? And possible answers to these two questions will be you should go there at 5 o'clock, for example, and you ought to go there at 5 o'clock. Modal verbs in negative yes-no questions can be used according to the following formula: modal verb plus not plus subject plus main verb in infinitive and object. And here are some examples. In a positive sentence with a modal verb will be we can be friends, or we must visit the dentist. Let's look at question sentences, negative yes-no questions. Can't we be friends? Or mustn't we visit the dentist? Well, students, now we have revised the basic rules of using modal verbs in positive, negative, and question sentence. I would like you to watch a short video where you will listen to a short conversation between two people. Please pay attention how these people use modal verbs in their conversation.
Welcome to Jennifer Company, John. Do you have any questions?
Yes, what time do I have to start work?
You have to start work at 8 a.m.
What do I have to do?
You have to type letters, translate French, and answer the telephone.
Do I have to wear a uniform?
No, you don't have to wear a uniform, but some people like to dress more formally.
Can I smoke?
No, you mustn't smoke in the building. You'll have to go outside if you want to smoke. You're allowed to smoke in here.
I must stop smoking. It's really bad for my health.
I think you should.
Well, students, you have watched this short video, and now it's time to practice what and how well you have learned. Please look at the following sentences and try to find out what is wrong in these sentences. Well, students, let's check your answers. Here are the 3 rules we talked about, and your task is to put each sentence under these rules. For example, sentence number 1 says, you must to finish your homework. What's wrong here? Correct, we don't use to in this case. Sentence number 2, I shouldn't to smoke. Also, we don't use the part to. Sentence number 3 goes under the rule number 3. He not could come to your birthday. It is incorrect. We shouldn't say not, but not comes right after the modal verb. Sentence number 4, can they to stay here today? Also goes under the rule 2. We don't use to after the modal verbs. Sentence number 5. We don't must finish the project immediately. We still have 2 days. What is incorrect here? Right, we don't use don't. We use not right after the modal verb. Sentence number 6. She can speaks English well. There are 2 errors in this sentence. We don't change modal verbs in present, past and future tenses, as well as in the third person. On this slide, there are a lot of pictures and also some descriptions to these pictures. Please try to look at these pictures very carefully and also read the sentences. It seems like these people have problems. Let's try to help these people by giving advice. On this table, there are the sentences from the previous slide, and I would like you to give advice to each person using the modal verbs should, shouldn't, ought, ought not to. Sentence, I don't get enough sleep, would have this kind of advice. I think you ought to go to bed early. You shouldn't play computer games at night. Please try to write down your advice in front of each sentence. Do you have the same recommendations as I have? Well done, students! So, students, we are almost finishing our lesson for today, and let's revise what we have learned. Here, please look at these modal verbs and please try to put each of the modal verbs under these 4 categories. Well, students, I hope you have the same answers as I have here on this slide. Do you have the same answers? Well, you did it. It was a good job. Well, students, our lesson for today is over. I'm very thankful for your attention and being with me. I wish you a nice time and see you very soon again. Goodbye.